From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Thousands of Venezuelans have rallied in Caracas to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Caracazo. Caracazo is the name given to a series of protests and riots that began on February 27, 1989. Hundreds of people were killed by security forces working for the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez. The victims were protesting austerity measures and price hikes imposed by this neoliberal government. 30 years to the day, Venezuelans gathered to remember the historical event.
30 years ago, the Venezuelan people from Guarena, from Petares, made their voices be heard by taking to the streets. They demanded freedom. They called for imperialism and neoliberalism to stop running over them. Our people took to the streets 30 years ago, and they have never returned home. They have kept fighting for their freedom and sovereignty.
Our correspondent in Venezuela, Luis Tavera, brings us more details.
Today is the 30th anniversary of the Caracazo. Social and political organizations have gathered in Petare to say that they don't want any military intervention. They just want to live in peace. The president of the National Constitutional Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, joined these demonstrators and gave a speech in commemoration of the day. Those in attendance say they support the Constitution and will keep taking to the streets to defend it. More rallies are expected in the next few days.
That was Luis Tavera from Caracas. A fire was reported inside the Venezuelan port of La Guaira, located in the northern state of Vargas. According to local reports, the fire took place in warehouses where boxes of food from the Venezuelan food distribution communities are stored. Firefighters used 6 tanks of water to control the fire. The Venezuelan Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, blamed violent opposition groups for the fire and said the food will be replaced immediately.
We are at La Guaira port. The situation was controlled quickly by around 300 firefighters. Around 300 military personnel also helped control the fire. But it is very clear to us that this was a terrorist act. They were criminals attacking our food. The fire started in a warehouse where recyclable material and food was stored. But we know the intention was malicious. We think after the opposition was defeated in the United Nations, they did this. We are still walking in the right path, supporting a process that is going to bring happiness to our people. I condemned all these acts. We are still surveying the area and we will return to normality in a short time. We will continue making the clap box to help our people.
And earlier we were joined by David Abdullah. He's the leader of the Trinidad and Tobago-based movement for social justice. He told us about recent protests his movement held to demand the U.S. lift its economic sanctions against Venezuela.
And from the Venezuelan embassy, we walked to the U.S. embassy and demanded an end to sanctions and also hands off Venezuela, and also that there must be no military intervention in Venezuela. Next door to the U.S. Embassy is the Office of the European Union, and so we also made those same demands outside of the European Union, communicating that mass organizations, progressive mass organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, progressive political parties, are opposed to sanctions because that is causing more of a problem in Venezuela with respect to food shortages and medicine and so on. The sanctions is what is really hurting the people of Venezuela. And it is hypocritical for the US government of Trump and others to be talking about humanitarian assistance when much more money has been seized in US banks, in European banks and so on, and through the sanctions, which are illegal and illegitimate.
Caricom nations are wrapping up a 2-day summit in St. Kitts and Nevis. Leaders have discussed the unfolding political situation in Venezuela, Haiti, and Guyana, as well as the Caribbean single market and economy. Caricom members are expected to ratify their support for the Montevideo mechanism that seeks dialogue and a peaceful solution in Venezuela. Our correspondent Laura Prada was able to speak with Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown.
Yeah, we dealt with a number of issues affecting the Caribbean region, Caricom more specifically. Issues to include transportation. We also looked at the whole issue of security within the region and the Caricom single market and economy to make sure that we get to the stage where we have a fully operational single market and economy. I would say that we have made significant progress on the issues. We also looked at other regional issues, disputes between Guatemala and Belize, Ghana and Venezuela, and even the issue involving the situation in Venezuela, the political situation in Venezuela.
Prime Minister Gaston Brown also spoke about the position of the regional bloc on the situation in Venezuela.
Caricom will be issuing a statement. In essence, we continue to stand on the international principles of non-interference and certainly respecting the sovereignty of the people of Venezuela, and for the Venezuelans to resolve the issues on their own, to come up with their own Venezuelan accord, and that there should be no form of military intervention in Venezuela. So we're hoping that the parties concerned will utilize their best efforts to come to the table, to talk, to use diplomacy and dialogue in resolving this issue.
And about Haiti, because it's one of CARICOM members, what is the position?
Well, we're also hoping too that the situation there would stabilize. We want this hemisphere to be maintained as a hemisphere of peace. And I would go back to Venezuela. We're very concerned about the threats of intervention in Venezuela. We think that should be avoided at all costs, that this hemisphere should be maintained as a zone of peace. And the Caricom, would have issued a statement to that effect today. It will be published a little later in the day. And we just want to ensure that the parties Venezuela has assisted countries in the Caribbean with petrol on credit over 25 years, very easy terms, and they would have allowed for the funding of certain social programs within our respective countries. So those programs, for the most part, would have been jeopardized. And even the fiscal space that countries would have had from the credit that they received from Venezuela would have been impacted as well. So in essence, it's a situation in which we have a vested interest, and we're just hoping that the issues will be resolved as soon as possible and that we can have peace and tranquility in Venezuela.
Moving on, Venezuelan opposition lawmaker Juan Guaido is headed to Brazil on Thursday to meet the country's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro. This comes as the opposition and their allies plan their next move, following their failed humanitarian aid stunt on the border last weekend. Earlier this week, Guaido met with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence in Colombia as Pence announced new sanctions against the Venezuelan government. Our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Brian Muir, has the story.
I'm in Sao Paulo, where at 10 o'clock tonight, Juan Guaido is expected to arrive from Colombia on a flight for meetings with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to talk about a possible plan of action for renewed aggressions against the democratically elected government of Venezuela. Now, some people are questioning his judgment and even wanting to meet with Bolsonaro because Bolsonaro was unable to establish consensus within his own ruling coalition to support Donald Trump's so-called humanitarian move on Saturday, February 23rd against the government of Venezuela. Apparently, according to Folha do São Paulo newspaper, many of Bolsonaro's top generals, as well as House Speaker Rodrigo Maia, spoke out against any participation in the initiative, and that's why the government only sent 2 pickup trucks with a small amount of supplies on them to partake in this, what appeared to be a publicity stunt that was held on the Brazilian border with Venezuela. So Guaido is arriving. There's going to be a lot of media attention for it, but will there be any concrete results? General Hamilton Mourão, Vice President of Brazil, said the day before yesterday in Colombia that Brazil will not allow the U.S. military to use its territory to launch any kind of military attack against Venezuela, and Brazil will also refuse to engage in these kinds of attacks.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Nicaraguan government and the opposition have begun peace talks in the capital, Managua, aimed at ending the political crisis. 6 representatives of the government and the opposition arrived for the round table. Ahead of the peace negotiations, the government released dozens of prisoners arrested during last year's protest. Over the months of unrest, just over 250 people lost their lives, according to the country's Truth, Justice and Peace Commission. And Ecuadorians have launched the constitutional process to oust President Lenin Moreno. Denise Herrera has the details.
Several social organizations and citizens have gathered outside the Electoral Council in Quito to ask for the recall of President Lenin Moreno. With banners, slogans, and music, the demonstrators said Moreno is not adhering to his government plan.
The non-compliance with the plan that was initially presented by Moreno is one of the main arguments for this revocation. For 2 years, the president has talked about corruption, and now he must face the situation.
He must go. Ecuadorians can no longer bear this unconstitutional government. We are out of work. We don't want his dictatorship.
Representatives of Migrant submitted a document with their concern to the Electoral Council. They said they are worried about the current situation in Ecuador.
We have a month before we have a response from the court, which has to comply with the law. What we are asking is our right, as given to us by our constitution. Our constitution says the citizens can ask for the resignation of a president who does not comply with his government's plan.
Meanwhile, different political movements have asked the President of the National Assembly take action against Moreno on the corruption investigation that reveals offshore companies linked to the Moreno's relatives in Belize and Panama.
It is a very serious complaint, and it must be condemned. It is very crucial that the results of the investigation are analyzed and appropriate action taken. The law and the Assembly must act because the country must know the truth.
One of the lawmakers of the Citizens' Revolution movement, Ronnie Aliaga, visited Spain recently to begin a new investigation against Moreno related to a luxury apartment he owns. Aliaga says he doesn't trust Ecuadorian law because there have been many irregularities in the investigation related to Moreno. Denise Herrera, Telesur, Quito, Ecuador.
The United States Health Department has received more than 4,500 complaints of sexual abuse against migrant children detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. The complaints were made between 2014 and 2018. The Department of Justice reportedly received more than 1,300 additional complaints of sexual abuse against unaccompanied minors during the same period. Most of the complaints were against independent child care service centers that are contracted by state officials. Egypt Transport Minister has resigned following a deadly train crash that killed at least 20, and 43 were injured when a train crashed through the buffers at the main station in Cairo on Wednesday. Security sources said there's no indication the crash was deliberate.
Some accidents are, of course, acts of fate. Nonetheless, the responsible parties will be held accountable. In the coming days, people will see how those negligent parties will be held accountable. Thank you.
Nigeria's opposition leader Atiku Abubakar has announced the country's election results, calling them a sham. Abubakar has promised a legal challenge that could dominate Nigeria's politics for weeks. Meanwhile, re-elected President Muhammadu Buhari has maintained that the elections were free and fair. The president of Rwanda has criticized universal jurisdiction for bias against Africa and its people. Speaking at a function, Paul Kagame said universal jurisdiction only empowers Western courts to prosecute African leaders for crimes, but does not allow African courts to put Westerners on trial in African courts.
This is not possible. He said, if you are doing that, and they called it universal jurisdiction that give the powers to these judges. And we said, okay, if actually your judges have powers to do that, to indict people in Rwanda or elsewhere and take them to the courts in France, if it is universal, then our judges should have the authority to actually indict your people and bring them to the courts of law.
A new film set during the 2010 post-election violence in Ivory Coast premiered on Tuesday at Africa's biggest film festival, FtS. The Romances, directed by Apolline Traoré, tells its story during a crisis where 3,000 people perished. It highlights the courage and wisdom of women in the face of men's madness. The film was screened at the Pan-African Film and Television Festival.
We are in a minority, first of all. We are in a minority in everything. When you look at the selection, there are only 4 of us. There have been FtS where I was the only woman, but we fight and hope that one day people will recognize that women too, as I showed in my film, are capable of anything.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump have begun their second summit on the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula on good terms. They met for a brief one-to-one before they had dinner. They are set to meet formally on Thursday to discuss peace and denuclearization in the Korean peninsula in more detail. Reports say it's unclear what, if any, real progress will be made since the last summit in Singapore. At least 4 people have been killed and dozens remain buried following the collapse of an illegal gold mine in Indonesia. According to the country's disaster agency, more than 60 people were buried under the landslide caused by the collapse. Rescue operations are being hampered by unstable ground conditions due to the number of holes dug by miners. Survivors are being treated in hospital. The confrontation between Pakistan and India over Kashmir has escalated dramatically. Both sides now say they've shot down each other's warplanes. Pakistan says it downed 2 Indian jets in its airspace and one of its pilots, while India confirms the loss of one of its planes and says it shot down a Pakistani fighter jet. In response to the violence, Pakistan has closed its airspace until further notice. At least 6 airports were shuttered in India. Pakistan's Prime Minister is now calling for talks. And tensions between the 2 countries have been high since the February 14th suicide bombing in Indian-occupied Kashmir that killed 40 Indian troops. On Tuesday, India warplanes responded by flying into Pakistani airspace and striking a camp of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the group that claimed the Kashmir bombing. It was India's first airstrike in Pakistan since 1971. Earlier, we spoke with Telesur political analyst Tariq Ali about the rising tensions between India and Pakistan.
But in Kashmir as a whole, I would say that between 70 to 80% of the population is hostile to the way in which India has been governing and ruling this province from 1948 onwards. This has escalated now into a full-blown conflict. And the fact that one of the BJP leaders has said we should boycott Kashmiri goods indicates that they don't regard Kashmir as part of India. Otherwise, why make such a stupid remark if you think that Kashmir is a sovereign part of India? So it's a crisis that is refusing to go away, and there are possible solutions, but the Indians, who are the main party in the dispute, are refusing to budge. And within India itself, within Indian civil society, there is very little support for the Kashmiris.
Israeli forces have arrested a senior Fatah member and 33 other Palestinians during multiple raids across the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. According to the Palestine Prisoners Society, Zakaria Zubeid was arrested alongside his lawyer. Zubeidi was a leading member of Fatah's armed wing, but was later given amnesty by Israel in a deal reached with the Palestinian Authority. Israeli forces frequently raid Palestinian houses across the West Bank on the pretext of searching for wanted Palestinians. Kazakhstan's president has pledged to spend several $billion on social programs ahead of the presidential election next year. The news comes less than a week after he sacked his government for the lack of economic progress in a country that is feeling the brunt of plummeting oil prices. At a party conference, he said that over $5 billion will be spent on social programs to help low-income families. He also said he will boost salaries for public workers and improve gas and electricity supplies.
Assistance should be provided to those who need it most. I will personally check that all the funds allocated reach each family and each person. Our main priority is to guarantee an adequate standard of living for our citizens and to make Kazakhstan a socially oriented state. Even in the most difficult times, we have fulfilled our social obligations.
Spain's former Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy has testified in the trial of 12 pro-independence Catalan leaders. Rajoy was in power at the time of the Catalonian independence referendum in 2017 that sparked riots. His right-wing government deployed thousands of police to Catalonia, who used excessive force against protesters. During the trial, he said, if laws had been followed, violent images would have not surfaced. The Catalan leaders are accused of rebelling and could face up to 25 years in prison. And finally, U.S. President Donald Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has called his former boss a racist and a conman. Cohen made those remarks while testifying before U.S. Congress. He also revealed how Trump instructed him to lie about a lucrative real estate project he had in the works in Russia while he was running for president.
You need to know that Mr. Trump's personal lawyers reviewed and edited my statement to Congress about the timing of the Moscow Tower negotiations before I gave it. So to be clear, Mr. Trump knew of and directed the Trump-Moscow negotiations throughout the campaign and lied about it. He lied about it because he never expected to win.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.